Hi, I'm Rob Langton from Development Ready. Our interview series delves into the lives of Australia's most respected property thought leaders and decision makers and uncovers what makes them tick. This is the interview. Rod Fehring, CEO of Frasers Property Australia. Rod, thanks for your time this morning. I want to talk about a number of different things today, but let's start off from the very start. Where'd you get your start in property?
Very first job I got was in central Victoria, up in with the city of Maryborough. My job was as an economic development officer, which meant I spent my time trying to sell industrial land. We did an industrial subdivision, and it was a manufacturing town in those days. This is way back in the late 70s, early 80s. We had some successes, and we got a fish processing plant located up there to distribute into central Victoria. So that was my first introduction into industrial development, if you like. And then I moved down to Melbourne, spent time with the Victorian Department of Planning at a time when David Yenkin and Evan Walker came together as a minister and a head of department, and their prime focus was on redeveloping Melbourne. This was in the very early 80s, and getting Melbourne to actually wake up, turn its face to the river rather than back onto the river, make Melbourne a place that people wanted to live in. My job when I came down was to work as a project manager on delivering some of those projects that would actually be part of what was called then Central Melbourne Framework for the Future. This is in the 80s, and what that gave rise to was South Bank. It gave rise to the location of the tennis centre where it was, the whole push to get residential reintroduced into postcode 2000. So I loved that, and the power of project management and planning to shape urban economics, that was it for me. That was when I really got a taste for property and what's possible through the planning system. So I did a planning degree with a project management focus, and the rest of it's followed from there, one way or another.
And you spent a large proportion of your career at Delphin, which later became Lend Lease. What was your role there?
I looked after the Victorian operations. Delphin was a Adelaide-based company and household name in Adelaide, and had expanded its presence into Brisbane through its Forest Lake project, specialised in large-scale, long-term urban master plan communities. And they wanted to get into the Victorian market, and my job was to help do that. So I left the Urban Land Corporation where I was and joined Delphin back in the early 90s. And that gave rise to projects like Caroline Springs, a whole suburb, 8,500 people, dwellings I should say, so 20,000 people. We started that in the mid-1990s, and plus a 25,000 square metre shopping centre, 25,000 square metres of office, etc., etc. And it's become a suburb in its own right, and very powerful model at Delphin, and that was what attracted Lend Lease to it, because Delphin as a listed company, it's hard to be a listed property company pure play. And so you really do need to be part of a diversified group. And what residential development does is it delivers big pops when the market's strong, and the art of it is to find ways to ensure that you can keep working profitably through the downturns, because it's cyclical. But the sort of disciplines that Delphin introduced into Lend Lease in its land management businesses held Lend Lease in great stead through a very troubled period for Lend Lease in the early 2000s.
And sort of fast forwarding or going back, based on what you said there, to the 2000 Sydney Olympics, what sort of impact did that have on the landscape of Sydney, and I guess more broadly, what sort of impact did it have on Australia as a destination? Well,
I joined Lend Lease after the Olympics, not during them. Went to them like everyone else did, which was fantastic. But the only involvement I had really was in mopping up the aftermath of the Newington project, which was the Olympic Village. But it's fair to say that it had two interesting but opposite effects. It gave the whole of Australia, and Sydney in particular, a real sense of achievement, a real sense of internationalisation, a real sense of coming of age, if you like, on the one hand. On the other hand, what that brought with it was interest from offshore in Sydney as a place to invest, interest in the growth of Sydney. But the reaction was to slow Sydney down. The Sydney is full mentality grew in that period of time, and that unfortunately had some quite serious longer term side effects that Sydney is only just sort of getting itself out of now. which the lack of infrastructure investment that went on, the growth of congestion because of that lack of infrastructure investment, etc. All of that, I think, could have been avoided with a more balanced view about how competing demands could have been managed in a more constructive way.
And how did the group Lend Lease, how did you manage to sort of lead that group through the 2008 GFC? And what were some of the lasting impacts off the back of that?
Lend Lease is a complicated, wonderful company, complicated though. It's primarily a building culture. It does development, yes, and it does investment management, but all in order that it can do more building. My job was from the development point of view, initially in the early 2000s, was to address and reposition a number of development projects in the old Lend Lease development portfolio, and grow the development business in terms of what was called then the flywheel effect, to create opportunities for the development or the construction part of the business to come in and do what it does. And then in some cases actually spin off then investment grade assets to then place with the funds. So that dynamic is something that Lend Lease has been doing since 1958 with the creation of GPT. But my job was very much in that development space, large urban regeneration, master plan types of projects. But like all things, you get to a point in your career where you're asked to do other things. And I was asked to set up a corporate ventures group within Lend Lease just before the GFC. Easy to say, hard to do. And the GFC came along and put paid to that. And for my sins, I then took responsibility for the old Adcock and Brown Communities business. I was asked to head that business up and figure out how to reposition and reconstruct the business during the GFC, which was tough. It was really hard. But we got there, we internalised it, but 24 board meetings in 15 months. We ran out of money, I think, in the first 6 weeks that I took over. So we had to recapitalise it pretty quickly. We had banks wanting their $700 million of debt refinanced or prepaid in very short order, etc. But at the same time, you're managing a portfolio of several $1 billion worth of assets, but with a significant aged care component within that portfolio, with the most vulnerable people in the community at stake. So walking away was never an option. So we had to find the right structure, and we did that. And I think Lend Lease has benefited from the experience.
And tell us about how you got to where you are today at Frasers Property. What attracted you to the business initially, and what were some of those early roles and opportunities you saw?
The GFC, it was hard. Really stressful. Very intense a period of time, and I felt that after finalising the privatisation of the business in late 2009, early 2010, it felt like time for me to do something else. And I didn't want to leave Lend Lease on the one hand, but on the other hand, I sort of felt that I needed to go and do something else just for my own sense of well-being. And Bob Johnson and I knew each other obviously from Lend Lease days. Bob ran the global business, construction business. A lot of admiration for Bob, wonderful individual. And he approached me to work with Australand to help, because everyone that post-GFC had problems. So I sort of went from solving one problem to solving another problem, which was to reposition the residential business in Australand. I recall I said, "Oh, look, this will take 2 years, and we'll get it in shape in 2 years." I recall sort of wandering into Bob's office at about 20 months after joining. I go, "Oh, Bob, I don't think this is going to take 2 years. I'm not going to be done in 4 months. It's going to take a bit longer." And Bob was a hard taskmaster on the one hand, but on the other hand, a realist as well. And so we spent, and then during that period, then we got an unsolicited offer to buy Australand from, and the unloved child, of course, at that time was the residential business, so I felt really popular. That transaction didn't happen, but ultimately then Frasers acquired Australand from left field, because Stockland had taken a position of 19.9% in the business and were, for all intents and purposes, in the processes of finalising the acquisition of shares it did not already own. And from left field, Frasers came in and did more work in a matter of 2 months than we'd seen in the last 2 years from all other suitors. So when Frasers move, it moves really quick.
And tell us about the business today. I mean, what sort of projects have you got underway? What opportunities and challenges do you see in the market?
Well, look, we've had, with Frasers and Australand, you've sort of brought one business, which was the Frasers business in Australia, was primarily Perth and Sydney, so not really known outside of Perth and Sydney, and bespoke projects. The Queen's Riverside project in Perth, in East Perth I should say, and of course the Jewel in the Crown, which was Central Park in Sydney. Central Park, put together by Dr. Stanley Quick as part of the Frasers approach. Redevelopment of the old Carlton United Brewery site, which ironically Australand had an option over for 4 years, but during the GFC had to relinquish it because the GFC had its way with everyone's balance sheet in those days, and Frasers picked it up. So it's ironic that the two came back together, and that project has won every accolade that you could possibly ever seek, and transformed a whole section of Sydney. But that was the Frasers book, and then the Australand part was very much focused on industrial development activity and residential. It's two core businesses with complementary bit of office complementary to the mixed-use component, a bit of retail complementary to the residential component as well. And so what you saw then was, and Australand was very much positioned in that sort of mid-market segment. And my job, the very first thing I did was to take it out of the detached dwelling building side of the market and focus exclusively on medium density housing, but in the mid-market, sort of plus and minus 15% of the median value in any market that we're in, whereas Frasers were focused more at the top end of the markets that they were focused on. So blending the two then was an interesting exercise. But I'd done that in blending the Delphin and Lend Lease business before, and doing similar things with the Babcock and Brown communities and the Lend Lease people as well. So this was my third time round on doing integration. So culture, then what you learn out of all of that is culture is critical. People are critical. You can talk about everything else, but unless you've got the right culture and the right people, it doesn't work. And thankfully, we've got the right culture and the right people, or built the right culture and the right people in the business. We've got an appetite for risk as an organisation. Grown in the last 5 years as CEO, have grown the industrial book to now about $6.5 billion in assets, just quietly. I'm a fundamental believer in the importance of getting the business model right. So the asset creation piece, and then the distribution element into the capital markets via a REIT. Not exactly original, Lend Lease have been doing it for 50 odd, 60 years, thereabouts. So, but that works, and it's worked brilliantly well, and that growth sort of has been aided by the momentum that's the market's put behind the industrial sector and logistics particularly, because what we're seeing is this convergence of sectors. You know, essentially retail and industrial are now converging in some ways by virtue of e-commerce. In other ways, commercial and residential are converging, particularly with COVID, is accelerating all of that as well in that regard, because now where you work is an interesting question that even 6 months ago you would say, well, people work in offices, don't they, when they live in cities, or work in factories, but essentially there's an office version of that. No, I think I think home is increasingly becoming a place of work, as well as a place of consumption. So I think there's an interesting dynamic that's at play there. Retail is going to have to reinvent itself effectively, and it's going to be far more experiential going forward. But all of that flows into the emerging and re-emerging importance of place. And if I was to pick a thread through my entire working career in property, which I learnt very much from going all the way back to the South Bank days in the early 80s, is the importance of place. Urban design and its ability to create a sense of destination where people want to be, where they associate their emotional experiences with, etc., that are shaped by stuff that goes on not only in the architecture but in the vacant spaces between the architecture. All of that builds, if you like, a sense of gravity or glue. And if you can get the alchemy of that right, then property is an easy business to run. But if you get it wrong, it's tough, really tough. Because what I've found through cycles, through GFC, the recession in '83, the recession in 1990, the GST introduction, the GFC, now the COVID, the good property finds its market, and good property usually is created in place. So the dynamics of place are fundamental in that regard.
And what sort of impact have the past 3 to 4 months had on Frasers as a business?
Accelerated everything, which sounds a bit weird because we're shutting everything down, but on the same token, what that's forced is it's forced you to look at, is your business model right? It's forced you to look at your positionings in terms of how you've organised yourself strategically for what the future might look like, equipped to be able to get the capabilities and the culture that we've got in the organisation to be able to pivot quickly to respond to opportunities as they present themselves. And so the changes that we've introduced, which we started about 18 months ago, have been all directed towards moving ourselves into and morphing ourselves into a business that's capable of executing on mixed use. Why? Because, coming back to that place theme, mixed use ultimately only works in an environment where the place elements are uppermost in the design thinking. Because if you're thinking that way, then the property elements of it then start to take shape in a way that actually gets informed by different considerations than just the yield, the WALE, and the rent that you can secure, or what the price and margin you can deliver on a residential product, or the retail opportunities and scope and mix of retail mix that you can introduce. So I think that's the emergent opportunity, and we've removed a lot of the obstacles to enable us to be far more nimble in how we respond to mixed-use opportunities. And that's all been accelerated by COVID.
I've got to ask you this because everyone's got an opinion on it. What is the future of office? Some are saying it's still in the city, just smaller footprints, and some are saying it's city fringe markets, smaller buildings with less tenants. What do you think it is?
Offices just so happen to be located in interesting places. So my view is that I think offices will continue to be desirable places to be and desirable assets to own. I think footprints will change, because one thing that we've learned out of this is that, and just as we were talking before we started this discussion, that we could well be in this new normal, a hybrid version of working in office for a few days and at home for 2 or 3 days or whatever. The blending of time between when you're at work and when you're not, where you work, etc., all of that's getting merged, and that's likely to be in place for the next 18 months, maybe 2 years, don't know. Once people get used to that, it's going to be hard to turn back. So I don't think we'll return to 6 months ago. I think we'll turn to something which is actually far more flexible. Workplaces everywhere, digital technology, the lot, everything is making things far more flexible and choice-based. And as a consequence, organisations are going to have to change about how they engage the best people in their organisations to want to work with them. Because I think there is going to continue to be a war for talent, especially in Australia, where the ability to actually be as mobile as we have been internationally is going to be more limited by virtue of COVID. And so I think there will always be a place for offices. I think the likelihood for major new offices rather than the repositioning of existing offices will be an interesting dynamic that will play out. And I do think that organisations will choose different formats for the way they use office space as part and parcel of a transformation of their working culture.
One final one. What's next for Rod Fehring? Where do you go from here?
Oh, okay. Well, 40 years is a fair while. I'll be taking responsibility for some of the group activities and contributing to how Frasers position itself as an international platform. I'll continue to act as chair of the Australian business and the UK business as well, and our industrial business as well. So that then becomes a sort of a portfolio interest, if you like. So I'm moving to a 50% workload, but to work on more strategic things. And I've got some fantastic people who have grown up in the business, have got good spread, across the business, Rainey Otter and Nat Knox looking after the industrial business. That's an international platform now. It's got a big portfolio to run, and they're at the perfect ages to take that opportunity to the next level. And Anthony Boyd stepping into the role for the mixed-use Australian business. Again, perfect age, perfect time, good rounding in that space, and will show me a clean set of heels any day. So I'm going to sit back a little bit and help them be as good as they can be, which is essentially my job there.
Rod, you've had a fantastic journey right throughout your career. Thanks so much for your time, and look forward to seeing what you achieve next.
Thank you very much.